everybody. Oh, it's great to see so many friendly faces and friends of the museum, and Ann Shafer, who has brought her own entourage here, which we love. Thank you so much for coming. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. My name is Christine Rank Carter. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the curator for the Liebherr-Ratner Museum of Art, and I'm really excited to have such a wonderful program for you this evening with our special guest, Ann Shafer, who is an independent curator and someone that I knew when I worked at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She is just amazing, and we're thrilled that she happened to be visiting the area and could see us in person. Today I want to have a very special thank you to our program sponsor, Professor Marjorie Greengraff. Marjorie is a retired printmaking professor for St. Petersburg College. She helped develop the printmaking program here over 21 years. And after she retired, she actually became a museum docent and is the founder of the printmakers group 24 Hands. So we're extremely thankful for Marjorie's support, and we're thankful for everyone else's support with our upcoming programs, which we have flyers at the front desk that you can pick up on your way out so you can come visit the next one, which actually is going to be March 24th, so a month from now. We actually have a wonderful colleague and friend of Ann Shafer's, Christina Weil, who is an author of Women of Atelier 17. So that will be in celebration of Women's History Month, and that'll be on Zoom, so you'll find that link on our website, but that should be pretty interesting. And then, April 8th, we have two programs in one day with collector Tyrus Clutter, who is responsible for loaning us his collection from Stanley William Hayter and Atelier 17 for the Greater Than 17 exhibition. So please look on our website. You'll see more information about it. And thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview so you know how all of this ties together. In celebration of Lerma's 20th anniversary, we're highlighting masterworks from the collection and honoring the collectors, artists, and donors that built upon its foundation. This exhibition is like a survey of the evolution of modern art, with Abraham Ratner at the center of its story and the friendships he had with many of these legendary artists, including Pablo Picasso, Jean Moreau, Marc Chagall, and Stanley William Hayter. Greater Than 17, The Art and Influence of Stanley William Hayter is a traveling exhibition from collector, professor, and printmaker Tyrus Clutter. This complements Lerma's Masterworks exhibition by highlighting a major milestone in the modern art movement. From the time Surrealism emerged in Paris to the beginning of the abstract expressionist movement in New York, Stanley William Hayter and his renowned Atelier 17 were at the center of it all, and he continues to influence artists around the world today. Our special guest speaker this evening, Ann Shafer, is an independent curator, art historian, writer, and leading expert on intaglio printmaking by Stanley William Hayter and Atelier 17. Formerly, Ann was the associate curator of prints, drawings, and photographs at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she curated a variety of exhibitions, including On the Mark, Contemporary Works on Paper in 2010, Front Room, On My Lay in 2013, On Paper, Alternate Realities in 2015, as well as Front Room, Brumberg and Schneeren in 2016. She also organized the museum's Contemporary Print Fair in 2012, 2015, and 2017, featuring an international array of 20 presses, publishers, and dealers. Currently, Ann is bringing the print fair back to Baltimore in the spring of 2022, and she hosts two podcasts, Plate Mark and The Curator's Choice. Ann has a BA from the College of Worcester and an MA from Williams College. In addition to the Baltimore Museum of Art, Ann has worked at the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Williams College Museum of Art, and the National Gallery of Art. So without further ado, Please welcome Ann Shafer.
You make me sound so good.
You are.
Thank you. Yeah, Christina and I worked together at the BMA years and years ago, 20-some years ago.
Like 20 years ago?
Yeah, like 20 years ago. Can you hear me okay? Okay. My parents are here. Everyone say hi. Hi, Dad. Hi, Julie. All right, so I am here to talk to you about Atelier 17 and Stanley William Hayter. I assume you've all looked at the show, and I assume you probably have read the words on the wall and know everything I'm about to tell you, but I'm going to retell it to you anyway. Okay. Thanks, Chris, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and thanks to the staff at the Lee Ratner for the invitation. Unexpected and delightful. It's great. Okay, we're going to get going. The reason that I love the Atelier 17 and Hayter, the founder, is because they are a perfect tool with which to reinsert printmaking into the capital C canon of art history. Because lots of artists work in printmaking as they're working in everything else, but printmaking is always over here. So as a print curator and a die-hard print evangelist, I'm always shouting from the rooftops. This is a perfect example of why we need to reinsert it. The Atelier 17 it's a workshop that's fully entwined in Western art, as I said. It encompasses from its start in surrealism through modernism and up through abstract expressionism. It began in 1927-28. Christina can tell you better. She did the deep research on when exactly it was. Hayter kept terrible records. Just, we're not quite sure when it started. But it is known that it started because he had two female artists approach him and say, can you teach us something about intaglio printmaking? And I don't know how many print people are here, but intaglio printmaking is all of the stuff on metal, etching, copper plate, engraving, aquatint, that sort of thing. Hayter was a man of legendary charisma. He was described by Anna East Nin, the author, the poet, as a, quote, stretched bow or a coiled spring, every minute witty, swift, ebullient, sarcastic, which I think is a perfect description of him. I never met him, I wish I had, but everyone describes him as just quick-witted, always curious, super generous with his time and with his knowledge. He was trained as a chemist and geologist. He was a polymath, a walking encyclopedia, and his own art, was informed by his interest in mathematics, Jungian psychology, and the natural world, natural phenomena. He also wrote, his writings expound on technique, printmaking techniques, but also on the meanings that can arise from using particular tools and approaches. And for Hayter, the tools and materials an artist used, whether you were cutting into copper or splashing paint on a canvas, he was a lifelong painter as well, always maintained a painting studio on the side. They were not simply means to an end, but instruments of discovery. He really believed in the path an artist took in the path of creation. While he was a master of his craft, for Hayter, the mechanical piece was inseparable from the development of those ideas. The content and the technique were intertwined in what I've come to think of as a Mobius strip. One informs the other, it goes round and round and round. The workshop, and I should stop and say, I'm going to lay out the workshop and how it worked, and then I'll turn to Hayter himself and his own production of prints. The workshop started in Paris in 1928 when, we're back, Gladys Dalla-Husband, print in the show by her, Dalla-Husband, and Alice Carr de Creef, an American artist, asked him to learn printmaking, and he said to them, find a few more people to make it worth my while, and then I'll do it. So it started as a really informal, hey, let's get together and learn how to do this thing. The early history, by the way, has been fully researched, as I said, by Christina, so when you come and hear her talk, she'll give you the full skinny. And also to say, her book on the women at the Atelier is superb. Once it got rolling, the studio attracted surrealist artists and many others Atelier 17 welcomed anyone interested in making prints, and some famous names you probably already know from the early period in pre-war Paris include Alexander Calder, who was a neighbor and friend, Giacometti, he was also a neighbor, had a studio nearby, Juan Miro, Kandinsky, Masson, Picasso. It moved to New York during World War II and returned to Paris after the war, where it remains today. You can go there today. It's called Atelier Contrepoint. It's at Rue Didot still, 10 Rue Didot. This is the address from which the studio took its name, 17 Rue Campagne Première. That's me on the right. I was like a giddy schoolgirl standing in front of a 17. I can't even tell you. The workshop was at 17 Rue Campagne Première, as I said. But for me, the fact that they didn't take the name Atelier 17 until 5 years into the establishment of this enterprise hints at its informality. That he wasn't really trying to start the thing that it became. From the beginning, the Atelier operated rather casually, with an open door policy and an atmosphere of collaboration, due mainly to Hayter's generosity of time, energy, knowledge, and equipment. His goal was to bring like-minded people together to work toward new ways of expressing ideas and images. Hayter believed that more could be discovered with more people contributing and sharing. He was big on collaboration. And think about it, if you were sitting at the studio working on a plate, you could be sitting next to Juan Miro. Like, it was very egalitarian. Prints by Hayter and his associates are conceptually and passionately full of ideas about the human condition, dreams, mythology, war, and natural phenomena. Hayter himself had a particular interest in the surrealist practice of automatic drawing. Does anybody know what that? Everyone knows what that means? Okay. So he exhibited with the surrealists. He wasn't a bona fide member of the situation. Breton was a pretty controlling character, apparently. But he did exhibit with them. And their practice of automatic drawing was basically, I don't like to think of it, but I think of it as doodling, basically. You're supposed to let your mind go, and you're supposed to draw, keep going on a daily basis. And eventually some forms, figures, images will recur. And those will be the things that will be preeminent, they will rise to the top of the pile, and those should be things that will be universally understood amongst all people because they're so present in your mind. It's jumping off of Carl Jung's theory about, all these, I can't even remember the word. Anyway, okay. The other thing you need to know is that the Atelier was responsible for 3 technical developments that changed intelligent printmaking moving forward for all time. The exceptional rigor of subject matter there was achieved by these 3 technical innovations, the first one of which is that Hayter revived the art of engraving, which he learned from Joseph Hecht, which is, you've got several Hechts out in this show, right? That's who he learned engraving from, so credit to him. Hayter believed that engraving was uniquely suited to address issues of modern art, which I find to be kind of a weird and pompous statement. I think I think engraving was easy. And it's not easy. If you've ever tried to push a beer in through some copper, you'll know it's not easy. But I think for him, it came easily, and it was a place and a way of making that allowed him to kind of go into his, sort of a trance kind of thing. He would carve and create directly on the plate, sometimes. Historically, engraving had been used to reproduce more famous works of art for a large market, like you see on the left there, the Mona Lisa. That's an engraving, not a photograph. But with the advent of photography, you can guess that these reproductive engravings became almost obsolete. I mean, sometimes you would find them up into the late 19th century. It's counterintuitive and tricky to master, but Hayter was drawn to engraving's ability to create lines that had this unbelievably crisp elegance. He loved that there was sort of this struggle between his hand and his brain, and in that struggle, I think he found his happy place, his métier. The second innovation was soft ground etching, which had been known before them, but what they did at the Atelier that was so special was that they started using lace, netting, paper, crumpled up paper, pantyhose, to create passages of tone, where before Goya and people like that would have used aquatint to create those passages of tone behind, say, the donkey. So on the right you see Sue Fuller, and that's all lace that she's used to create the form of that hen. And so with soft ground etching, it's sort of a waxy, sticky coating on the plate, and you can put fabric down on it, or lace, or whatever it is, stick it through the press, and when you peel the fabric up, the pattern remains. And so when you put the plate into that acid, it'll bite down on those little places, tracing the pattern that you would put on it, and producing the exact pattern. Third, Hayter and his colleagues, and we have to give credit to Krishna Reddy and Keiko Moti, you have works by both of those artists in the show. They developed several inventive methods of printing with multiple colors from a single plate, eliminating the need to print separate plates for each color. So traditionally, you had to basically do a color separation in your mind. The one on the left, the Debicore, is a 4-plate pole. It's basically a first CMYK. There's a black, a magenta, a blue, and a yellow plate in there, and they all have to be printed one on top of each other to create the color. And I don't know if you've tried printmaking, but registering multiple plates on a piece of paper is really difficult. The paper has to be damp when you put it through the press, and it contracts and expands. And so getting it just right is really a pain. And I think that Hayter, who didn't have patience for much, wanted to get around that. And so they were working for a long time, since the early 30s, on trying to figure out how they could do it with one pass through the press. So notice on the right, that's Shulin Chen at the Atelier, and that plate that she's holding is inked with 6 colors, all simultaneously. Yeah, I'll explain it soon. All of the techniques are counterintuitive to those of us who love a good etching. And I've come up with a trick. While you're looking at works by Atelier 17 artists, often when you think you're seeing etching, double check it's probably engraving, at least in the early years. When you think you're seeing aquatint, look again, it's probably soft ground etching. And when you see a color print, it's not the result of each color being printed from separate plates, but of being applied in a single pass through the press, and all the colors are on a single plate once. These were groundbreaking discoveries for prints and printmaking, and they changed the game moving forward. And perhaps because of the singularity of those achievements, the scholarship on the Atelier has tended to focus on those techniques. So they sort of overwhelmed everything else, rather than on what the artists were trying to say with their work. Hayter, though, he was eloquent. He wrote a lot, and he was eloquent about the content of art and about its means. Its purpose, he wrote, was to, quote, lead man to a fuller understanding of his terms of existence. So for him, he never, I think people would call him a technical wizard, but he never let go of this idea that content and technique had to be intertwined. The workshop was run like a cooperative. One didn't arrive with one's plate in hand. In order to have a master printer execute an edition, which was the common practice in traditional print shops, one rather was expected to do everything from carve the plate to proofing it as it went along its progress to printing the whole edition. When newcomers arrived, they were called nouveaux, arrived at the Atelier, Hayter would assess their skills, and he would assign them an exercise to create a plate of burin studies. And the burin is the tool that you carve into the copper in engraving. It was meant to be a plate upon which a new person starting out with engraving for the first time was to try and make as many different kinds of marks as they could to get themselves acclimated to the art of engraving and comfortable with the tool on the plate. Only when the artist was comfortable with the Buren, and everything was to Hayter's satisfaction, would they sort of be allowed to have free reign in the studio. But after that, artists were welcome to use the equipment and were expected to help keep the shop clean and stocked. And an additional benefit, of course, was that they were in the workshop sharing ideas and techniques with everybody else that was there. Hayter's belief that more artists would lead to new discoveries proves true. So this is a set of Buren studies by a friend of mine, Jim Stroud, who is a master printer and owns a press outside of Boston called Center Street Studio. And he, right after college, went to study with Hayter in 1980. And so he, of course, was a nouveau. And up on the top row, you can see how it progresses as he's adding different marks. And he's stopping periodically to pull a print to see how it's coming along. And of course, Jim's he's a perfectionist, so by the time he gets down to the 14th state, he's basically made it into a composition that makes sense, and it's not really just like mark, 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 which is perfect Jim Stroud. For all of their interest in the internal life of the mind and in surrealist modes of image making, like automatic drawing, the artists were living in Europe and in Paris in the 30s as threats of fascism and war rolling across the continent. Ironic, we're talking about that today. At Atelier 17, as elsewhere, the Spanish Civil War, which was rolling around from 1936 to 39, galvanized artists into political action. And in fact, the Atelier published 2 portfolios of prints for the benefit of Spanish refugee children. This one is Solidarity from 1938, and I hope you can read who's in it. It's Picasso, Miro, Tanguy, and Dalla Husband, who was responsible for getting Hayter moving in the first place. Hayter also took a position with the Office International pour l'Enfance, which was a coordinating office that accepted donations from artists in support of the cause. He also made a covert trip into Spain, although the literature doesn't really say why he went or what happened when he went. And in the studio, they hid Spanish refugees in the loft space in the studio, which was illegal at that point. You were barred from helping Spaniards in any way. When France declared war on Germany in 1939, Hayter left the copper plates and the presses. He took as many prints as he could, and he returned to London, which is where he grew up. By 1940, the next summer, he was in California teaching a class, and that fall, he established the Atelier in New York at the New School for Social Research on West 12th Street. He wasn't the only artist sitting out the war in New York, as you probably know. In its new home, the Atelier brought together an international and intergenerational group of artists where creative minds could innovate and experiment on everything, and they could do it together. And of course, Hayter was there, he spoke fluent French, probably some Spanish, and these artists felt comfortable there. It was a place they knew and understood, they knew what Hayter was about, and it was sort of this gathering place for these European emigres. Now, this image doesn't represent the Atelier itself, but it does represent this idea that artists were waiting out the war in New York. This is a great photo. In the center is Breton, the kingpin of surrealism, and Hayter's on the lower left there. He's sitting next to Leonora Carrington, who's a surrealist painter, and there's lots of amazing people in this photo: Piet Mondrian, Duchamp, Peggy Guggenheim, you name it. For many artists, the Atelier was transformative. And it was a place where ideas and themes, even shapes, were a common currency, which accounts for why sometimes when you see something and you think it's Hayter, it's somebody else, and they all start to look alike. This is why it happened. I happen to love them, so it doesn't bother me. Into this international mix came American artists like Jackson Pollock, Louise Nevelson, Louise Bourgeois, David Smith, and Robert Motherwell. And in addition to these big name artists, well, they weren't that big then, but there was hundreds and hundreds of lesser known to us now people who need to be better known. And a core group of those folks absorbed not just Hayter's techniques and processes and and his ideas, but the pedagogic potential. They went on and established printmaking departments in universities across the country. And this aligns with the return from war, the GI Bill, and all of these different interests that were developed into actual things you could study in university on the bill itself. So printmaking kind of in universities across the country kind of got its start at that moment. Some of the best known of Hayter's compatriots who started and taught at universities include Gaber Petterdy. There's one out there, I think. He worked with Hayter in both Paris and New York, and he taught at the Brooklyn School of Art, at Hunter College, and then went up to Yale in 1960 and taught there for 26 years. And so part of my plan, which never came about, was to create a family tree so that you could trace yourself back to Hayter. So if you were Chuck Close at Yale and you were learning from Gaber Petterdy and Petterdy was learning from Hayter, you had an H2, like a chemistry family tree. Lazansky was out at the University of Iowa starting in 1945. He went out there super early, and he established the printmaking department there, which remains a powerhouse printmaking program, and was there until 1985. He just died, I don't know, 5 years ago maybe. Time is a little liquid these days. Mish Cohn was at the California State University at Hayward from 49 till 86. Krishna Reddy, you have one of his prints out there, was a director at the Paris Atelier between 57 and 76, and then he was at NYU until he retired not that long ago. He died in the last 2 years, I think. And Ruth Weisberg is still teaching at the University of Southern California. She's been there since 1970. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people out there who studied under people who studied under people who studied under Hayter. The family tree is insidious, really. In addition, the Atelier was a model for professional print workshops, such as Tamarind, or Gemini GEL, or Universal Limited Art Editions, which are thriving today. They're still at it, they're still working. It's the whole thing kind of jumped out of, well, you could go back further to the WPA, but we won't. In my mind, it all starts with Hayter. In 1950, Hayter reestablished the Atelier in Paris and left the New York Atelier in, under the care of a sort of a string of artists who, without Hayter being there, kind of, I think it was impossible to keep it going, and it only lasted for 5 more years. And Hayter also, as I mentioned before, was a pretty prolific writer. He wrote books and essays, speeches and articles, and in them he contended that art helps us understand our place in the world and that the workshop was a perfect place for inquiry. He talked about this separation of content and technique and how that's a mistake. It's just amazing amount of thought, very philosophical and deep thinking about creation and art making. The two books that he wrote that are invaluable to people like me today are on the far left of this is my bookshelf at home. New Ways of Gravure, which was published in 3 different editions. This is the 1981 version on my shelf. And then About Prints from 1962. And they remain important references for both artists and historians like me. And they, in turn, inspired several of Hayter's colleagues to write books of their own. So these are more of them, although not all of them. In the decades after 1960, though, Hayter's emphasis on personal emotional expression was out of step with contemporary's new fascination with the external world, pop art, and minimalism. And in academe, the dominance of his ethos and style and his pedagogy prompted a backlash. And only in recent years, thanks to people like Christine and me, artists and historians have begun to reassess his work and its impact. Okay, that's it for the workshop part. Now we're turning to Hayter himself. In 2015, I took a research trip to Paris in order to do 3 things. First, I wanted to interview Mrs. Hayter, who's still alive. She was a bit younger than he. Second, I wanted to document the printing of one of Hayter's plates at the Atelier, and I'll show you more on that in a moment. Third, I was on a pilgrimage to find the locations of the scenes that appear in Hayter's portfolio, Paysage Urbain, which I acquired for the BMA in 2013, I think it was. It's from 1930. By 1930, Hayter embarked on this set. It was 6 engravings and dry points. So, well, one of them has mezzotint, but that's another story, depicting Parisian street scenes. They were inspired, they feature all of these sort of open figure forms. There's a horse on the lower left there. This is just basically a contour line. These kind of wire open forms are inspired by his friend Alexander Calder, who was working on his wire characters at that point. He opened up his drawn forms and delineated their contours and left alone this idea of interior shading or volumetric anything. The transparent solids are an essential feature of the prints. Each image depicts a Parisian street scene and a superimposed conflicting dreamscape, a surrealist landscape on top of it. So here, this one's, I think, the clearest of them. You can see a horizon line at the top, the sun, and then these figures with their shadow there, sort of cast on top of this street scene of these buildings. Atop and through the real places, the surreal visions are from his imagination, and he distinguished the two overlapping worlds by using 2 different techniques to make sure that you could distinguish what was happening, although sometimes it's hard to read. The concrete reality of the Parisian street is rendered in dry point, and the imaginary figures, the surrealist landscape that's on top, is rendered in engraving. Now, does everyone know the difference between dry point and engraving? Okay, I'm going to tell you. So, with dry point, you have a sharp point. The image on the left there shows somebody holding what's called a stylus, and you scratch through the copper. And as you do that, you're creating a gouged line that will hold some ink, but also what happens is it'll kick up these little fingers of burr of copper along the line, along the edges. And when it's printed, as you see on the top left there, it creates this, what is always described as a feathery line. With engraving, this tool on the right here is a burin, and the wooden handle gets placed in your palm, and you're pushing into the copper and you're turning the plate towards it. So it's the difference between a pull, as you're scratching, and a push. And it creates a completely different kind of line. So with the engraving, you kick up this V, very sharp V gouge, and you see the trailing bit of copper there. That's the result of whoever put that through there, curls up as you push. And so when you print it, you get a very sharp and clear line. And so at the top there, I think you can hopefully see the difference between the quality of those 2 lines. And for me, when I was just figuring out that that's what he was doing, that he was using 2 different techniques for 2 different realities, I thought, what the heck? What is he doing? But I love the fact that he's paying attention. He's very consciously giving you one world in dry point and one world in engraving. And it's sort of an inversion of expectation. The cultural associations with dry point are sort of, light and feathery and ethereal, but that's what he's describing reality with. And engraving is always, solid forms and crisp and clear, and that's what he's using to describe his dreams. So it's this really interesting inversion of intention in my mind. Oh, this one was really interesting. So sometimes when he's drawn the buildings, as he's gone along these Parisian landscapes, sometimes he draws directly onto the plate the way he's seeing it, so that when it's printed, it's backwards. And sometimes he's flipping it as he's putting it on the plate, so that it's right reading when it's printed. It's very curious. I haven't quite figured out why that is. And the other thing he does is he does the shot of that blind bar in the corner, but the next one is just across the street. So, see on the left, on the far left there, that's the corner of the wall of Père Lachaise Cemetery. So this image is that wine bar, and the next one is he just turned a little bit and did this alleyway in between the 2. And this image for me is I think the most sort of meaningful from the group. It's an indigent person, I believe, recently dead, lying on this street next to Père Lachaise. He hasn't gotten into Père Lachaise, something maybe bad to tell him. And the surrealist image that's on top of him in the engraving is a hand, which I think of as maybe the hand of whatever God you pray to, plucking a spirit to help it ascend to heaven, or could be artistic creation, is not sure. But here's a blow-up of it, and I think you can see the dry point, particularly in the tree on the top right and the rooftops of those mausoleums. And then the hand is this crisp, clear, different, totally different kind of line. And if you don't do it, but if you ever had it in front of you and you ran your finger over it, the engraved lines are like a speed bump. And the dry point is pretty flat. I mean, there's still something there, but the engraved lines are amazing. If you flip the prints over, usually you can see the entire design because it's so starkly standing up. Oh, that was me trying to figure out if we had the right corner. I was walking around Paris, freezing my butt off with Xeroxes of all of the prints, trying to find the buildings. Yeah, so we were trying to make sure we had the right spot. Okay. A year after those Parisian landscapes, he embarks on another set of prints for a portfolio called The Apocalypse from 1931. And to my mind, the sixth plate of that set bring together a lot of concerns that were starting in those Parisian landscapes. In this case, dry point lines articulate a vertical totem whose indentations reveal it as the negative space within a clenched fist, right? Everyone can see that? Okay. Sometimes it's hard for people to see, particularly the hand part. And then he uses dry point to outline the fingers of the hand. So up at the top, you can see the thumbnail, for instance. It's a hand that's squeezing this way. Everyone see that? Okay. So for this print, the thing that gets me is that he's using dry point to describe the void, something that's not there, and at the same time making it a solid something. And he's using engraving to describe a physical hand, but the description that he's giving it is open and there's really nothing there to describe. So there's this crazy in and out, both and situation going on with what is describing what and the bareness of it or the not bareness of it. And here's a close-up of that thumbnail up there. I think you get the impression that the BMA had, the Baltimore Museum had, was the dry point had lost some of its featheriness, but I think you could still see the difference in the line quality. Okay. Personage. Now, this is from 1946, and Hayter had spent the 40s and 50s seriously engaged with this issue of what is called mostly viscosity printing, although I have to tell you, he hated that term. He called it simultaneous color printing because every ink has a viscosity of some sort. So that's what I use on on all of my materials, just so you know. For artists who paint, of course, they can intuitively use color in any way. They just fling it there and there it is. But of course with printmaking, if you were going to separate into 4 different plates to get this to happen, you have to really plan it out. Plus that whole problem of registration. So they had Keiko Modi and all of those guys, they had worked for a long time to try and figure out how to get, if possible, to put all of the colors on the plate, stick it through the press once. This print is, I think, well, I consider it, and most people consider it to be his most important work. It's also often touted out in the history of printmaking. If you look up a book on history of printmaking, this is always in it. I never talk about it much, but that's what we're here for. So, during this time, he had created a large body of color prints in this vein that tackled mythology and physical conflict. There's always something bad happening to somebody. And in my mind, the destruction and carnage of World War II and its the revelations of the Holocaust and the A-bombs dropping in Japan, artists are reacting to that, and it's inescapable. It raises profound metaphysical and moral questions for everyone, including Hayter. And many of the color prints from this time are just really hard, like Death by Water, for instance, which isn't a color print, but it gets at that same idea, like, good Lord, somebody's drowning, why are we, despite its elegance. But this one is also his most personal print. It is a memorial to his son David, who died of tuberculosis when he was 16 years old. David had been raised by Hayter's first wife, Edith Fletcher, and had never really lived with Hayter until the final years of his life, when he was really, really sick. And so this print, with its boomerang shapes and its webs of color and tangled lines and this crazy dynamic arrangement of figures, it's the pinnacle of it, and I think the fact that it's the most personal just makes it even more special. It's got everything. It's got automatist engraving, it's got soft ground etching for tones and textures. It's got, it was the first successful large-scale use of this simultaneous color printing that they had developed, where he had rolled these colored inks through silk screens onto the plate that had been inked already with the black. I have a couple of pictures that I think will help us understand how he puts the picture together. I don't know if everyone's interested in this, but I'm always curious, like, how in the world do you put this together? So this is the first stage where he's got just the line work. This would be the result of his automatic drawing situation. This one also helps us, I think, understand where the 5 figures show up. This is called saying Personage, obviously, 5 people. There's some clues in the literature about who's what and where, but it's not exactly clear what 5 there are. So the lower right, to my mind, is David. I think we can agree. That figure that's above him, I think, is Hayter. The form on the left, that's kind of a 8 shape, is supposed to be, or has been described as 2 figures, one upside down and one right side up, which has never been easy to see for me. But if that's true, I believe that would be the biological mother and the stepmother, Helen Phillips, who was with Hayter when David came to live and die with them. So where's the 5th figure? I think it might be. I read the form at the far left with the beak as a bird and maybe as a harbinger of doom. I think that's the 5th guy. I could be wrong. Here's an impression with just the soft ground etching added for the tonal passages. And then, you know, Hayter's a real experimenter when he's in the shop. Like he's like, well, let's see how the transparency of that orange and that green and that magenta are working. And can I produce a blue up in that middle triangle? He's producing primary colors with using tertiary colors overlap, which is fascinating. So typical for his chemist, scientist brain. Let's see how I can manipulate color. And then these are 2 impressions where again he's playing with how thick or transparent he has to get the orange and the magenta to work, and this one is just a trial with just the green. So there's the whole sequence in a row. I also think that if you look at the lower right one, which is the finish, everything is done in this one, it's addition, it's the final, that there's a little ghost-like figure in the center, the sort of above the fray in the white space. That could also be the 5th character, David's spirit. Okay, this is one of my favorite prints of all time. This is called Cascade, and this is where I'm going to describe for you how simultaneous color printing works. Chris, the curator's excited. In the late 50s, Hayter gave up engraving with the Buren, so that line work disappears for a while. It comes back, but it disappears in this group of very abstract, drippy-looking works. He's using not the drawn line, but a variety of devices that he can set in motion with his hand, but are really, he has to give up his control, and they're really chance, right? He's got a pendulum with a can hanging, and he's got the resist, in there, and he's flinging it and circling it over the plates to get this splashing effect. And he's also got a certain kind of pen called a Flowmaster, which I think it's kind of like a fountain pen where you can kind of squirt it and squeegee it, you know, like get these sort of flings and skeins of drops. All right, are you ready? Here we go. Okay, so this is the plate for Cascade on the left. When I went to see Mrs. Hayter in, I don't know, 2014 or something, we had just purchased Cascade for the BMA's collection, and I asked her, I said, do you happen to know where the plate for Cascade is? She said, oh, it's in my storage locker. And she brought it upstairs. She's like, how would it be if I sent it to you as a gift? I was like, and I called the office. I'm like, I was so excited. It's so great. For me, not every museum collects plates, which I think is a mistake because sometimes they're so weird and complicated. Like the Krishna Reddys, you have to see the plate to get how that's all coming together. I still don't understand those. They're crazy. Anyway, so the one on the right is inked in Atelier. So they wiped it with black ink only and proofed it. And so what happens is the black ink hits the sort of bottom open areas of the open bite, and it is clinging to the sides of the shapes that were created with this flinging resist. Those are on the top level. I got so curious about this that we decided to try and make them. I finagled my two friends who are printmakers, I'm not an artist, to help me recreate this plate. So we made six or seven of them. And this has been my colleague Ben Levy on the right, trying to get the bubbles off of the zinc plate as it's getting bitten in the acid. All right, so here's what happens. When you open bite, you're creating these wide open spaces that can carry a little bit of ink, but not a lot of ink. So this is a cross-section of a plate. These are the vocabulary words I'm going to use. You've got the plateau, that's the top part where the image has been flung onto it, that's reserved, right? You've got the open canyon floor where the acid is bitten down, but you've also got the canyon walls along those shapes that have been reserved. So when you ink it with the black ink, it just clings to the canyon walls and maybe a little bit in the bottom of the canyon. The second step is to take a soft roller, big roller, soft roller with a gradient. In the case of Cascade, it's sort of a blue, pink, blue. You roll it across the plate, and the softness of it allows it to hit down in the canyon floor. So you've got a second layer of color, and all of the viscosities are different, so nobody's interacting with each other. They're rejecting each other. Everything stays put. The last piece is that you roll across the surface, the image surface of the plate, the plateau. And in that case, in Cascade's case, it's a sort of a green and yellow mix of ink that has gotten onto the thing. So, all right, here we go. So this is the plate that we created on the left, and this is it inked in black. So you can see the open bite areas where it's just a little bit gray, and the reserved areas where the flung resist hit are the white areas. This is it coming off the press. That's the proof of it with just the black ink. Then, Ben rolled up a gradient of pink and blue on each side of it and rolled it across with the soft roller so that it goes down into the canyon floor. It also rolls across the top, of course, but the green will cover up most of that. So here's the inked plate on the left and the proof on the right with just the second step. And then the final step is how he got the green and yellow. It took us a while to figure this one out. What we think happened is they rolled out green on the glass palette, and they plopped down some yellow, squished it around a smidge, but didn't allow it to blend. And then took the hard roller. It's kind of an offset thing. So you roll it across the palette with the splotchy onto the roller. Then you take the same roller and roll it across the plate. So you're just transferring that splotchy image from one to the other. So that's how you get this yellow and green combination. You've got the yellow splotches that come through also. So here's Cascade again on the left, and then three of the prints that we pulled. Make sense?
Is splotchy a scientific term?
Yes, it is. Well, so Ben, who is has an amazing brain for systems and order, developed this plan where we were describing things in two ways. One, you wanted to describe how the image got into the plate through etching or soft ground or whatever the technique was. But then there was also this whole other thing with how it was printed. So we developed this thing where it was, the first layer was printed in black intaglio, clinging to those painting walls. Second was a blue, pink, blue gradient, rolled with a soft roller across the top. That's called relief rolling. And then the third step was the yellow and green unblended, relief rolled using a hard roller across the top. So that's how we would describe this print in our new system, which we're going to copyright soon. Okay. This was the second part of my dream trip to Paris, where Mrs. Hayter brought one of Hayter's plates over to the Atelier Contrepoint to have the director of the Atelier, Hector Saunier, you have a print out there, do the printing for us so we could document it, videotape, and photograph it. Mrs. Hayter, she had identified something, another plate, not this one, that she wanted to bring, something, I forget which one it was, but she couldn't find it. So she randomly grabbed this one, but it turned out to be perfect because it helped me tie everything up in a bow, which you'll see in a sec. So there's the copper plate for torso. You can see there's image in it. There's the stripes and some squiggly lines. And the first step is for Shulin Chen, she's the master printer there, to card on the ink and wipe it intaglio into the lines, right? So she's got some maroon, some orange, and some green that she's carded on. She's pounded it in, daubed it in to make sure it's all in the lines, and then she's wiping the surface clean with some tarlatan and then finally with some Xerox paper or newsprint, depending on what shop you're in. Then Hector came along with another gradient roll. This is a hard roller, it doesn't need to be soft in this case because it's not a big open bite plate. He's got green, yellow, blue, and he's going to roll it horizontally across the image. So on the left there on the plate, you see there's blue across the top. There's sort of a little white. He's left a bit of space between the blue and yellow. Yellow across the middle and the green along the bottom. The shape of the torso that's in the center there, which is basically a lack of any ink, was done by using a mask that they put down on the plate before he's rolled the gradient across it, and then it comes peeling off of the roller after they're done inking it. So, heck, it was amazing. It was amazing. The torso, so the positive shape of that torso on the right is described by a lack of ink, right? So it's an absence of something that's actually describing a physical thing. And it echoes the conundrum from the 1930, actually it's 31, I made a mistake there, of the apocalypse, which is the clenched fist holding the positive volume of the air inside of it. And in this late print, he's come full circle. There's this 4 decades of accumulated knowledge and thinking about shapes and positives and negatives and is it there or not there have come together. It's amazing. Okay, that was after a day of printing in 2015. It's the only picture I have of the group, and Mrs. Hayter, of course, had their eyes closed. So I'm going to just very briefly run through a couple of associated artists that worked at the Atelier too. I put Nina Negri there to remind us that there are in fact many women who work there. But this also was the print that came into the collection at the BMA that got me started on the whole project. My colleague Rena bought it. Actually, I think she got it at auction at Skinner or something. And she brought it in, she presented it, and I was like, oh my God, who's that? And oh my God, I need to know more. So it sent me down this incredible path. This is Lazansky, who was the one that opened up the printmaking department in Iowa, indebted to Picasso, as you can see. It's so amazingly appropriate that Guernica is behind us. This is Petterdy, the gentleman who was at Yale for all of those years, also indebted to Picasso. Here's a pair of Miro prints. This just shows you how many ways you can print a single plate. He's inked it intaglio in both cases, but he's relief rolled orange across the top on the left and used his thumbprint to put blue, yellow, green, and red on this other one. and also to return and reiterate the fact that there were lots of women there, Bourgeois being one of them. Also, Louise Nevelson. Her prints are really interesting, weird, overly inked. Apparently she made a mess in the press room. Everyone was just disgusted with her. Mina Citron, not as well known, but a wonderful printmaker. I love this. This is a squid under a pier. It's fantastic. And then Dorothy Daner, who was early on married to this sculptor David Smith, who also made plates, or prints, at the Atelier in the early days. Excuse me. And then I just wanted to make a note about Jackson Pollock. I think it's worth noting, he worked at the Atelier in 1944 and 1945, and he produced a group of prints. I think there's 7 of them, and I think 6 of them are on both sides of a plate. So there's 3 plates, and he worked on both sides of those plates. They're not pretty. And after pulling 2 of each, 2 proof sets of each of the 7, he put the plates aside. They never got published. I think one set is at MoMA and one is still with the estate, I think. I have to double check that. And it wasn't until 1967 that, remember Pollock dies in 1956, that the plates were revived, cleaned up by Petterdy at Yale, and an edition was formally pulled. So if you see these out and about in museums around the country, they're probably a later printing. And it's clear that they are. Nobody's trying to hide anything, it's well known. But what's so fascinating is that Pollock is given so much credit for his revolutionary painting style, painting on the floor with the drips of paint, right? So I believe wholeheartedly that he learned to work on the surface horizontally from his experience with Hayter. One, Hayter was using the pendulum dripping resist thing early on, and I'm sure it was still hanging around when Pollock was there in 44, 45. And second, every printmaker works on their plates flat on a table. I mean, that's just how it works. And you also work at your plate from every angle. And third, Hayter maintained a painting practice and studio throughout his career, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, he was known to work on his canvases, both, he would set them at an angle on the easel, but also on the floor, as you see here. And I think, it's so obvious. And talk about a moment when printmaking and painting are intertwined. Here it is, right? Okay, this is my conclusion. You've been very, very patient, thank you. So Hayter and Atelier 17, they've long been acknowledged as critical forces in the revitalization of printmaking in Europe and the United States in the mid-20th century. And through his influence on Pollock and other painters, Hayter has been further recognized as an agent of change in modern and contemporary art more broadly. His belief in the fearless confrontation between artist and material, remember the intransigence of working automatically with engraving, not so. All of that stuff was fundamental to abstract expressionism, and his fostering of a collaborative work environment of counterintuitive processes created a space that many artists have occupied subsequently. The prints and other works that came from Hayter's hand, however, have not always received their due. His allegiance to representation, I forgot to mention with Cascade, it was abstract and drippy. He always named them something that would root them in reality, even if they looked abstract. So he never let go of representation as a meaningful subject. And abstraction, pure abstraction, never qualified for him. He was a little old school that way. So his allegiance to that representation made him seem less adventurous than those New York painters who learned from him, and his lifelong fascination with technical challenges, he was a scientist after all, and with harvesting the imagery of the subconscious, he was a Jungian, put him out of step with later movements from pop art to minimalism. But Hayter did what great artists must do. He wed technique and content in the pursuit of something new. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm sure no one's going to raise their hand. But if there are any questions, we have time for questions, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, what can we talk
Yes.
about? Yes.
a lot of times the men were wearing ties.
Yes.
Was that something that they did or thought they had to do?
Yeah, I think in those, being an artist was a job, and they went to work, and they're Matisse painted in a suit and tie every day,
Shorts.
right? Yeah, I think it was just the fashion of the time. You wore a tie to work. It's sort of dangerous in a print shop. You kind of need to have it pinned so it doesn't, pull you into the press or something. But yeah, they all dress that way. Yes.
I'd like to know how we funded Atelier 17. Did people pay, did we have subscription services for the prints that were made, or did people pay to work here, or what?
Yeah, he was not a great businessman. He would ask you to pay what you could. He would, raise money by selling a print or two. But when you look at some of the prints, I don't know if Tyrus's works are this way, but sometimes you'll see like $50 written on it. Like he didn't bring in a lot of money. But at a certain point, he became really a pretty good marketer. He organized exhibitions of Atelier 17 prints to travel all over the country, often, which I think really helped to spread their renown and probably increase some of their sales. But yeah, he was not a rich man.
Did the artist pay a fee to use the studio? We were talking about that earlier in the different ways that he was covering his overhead costs. But do you think they were just like any print studio where you would pay a fee to use the facilities and whatnot?
Yeah, I think that especially during the years when it was part of the New School for Social Research and it was kind of run like a class, although it wasn't really a class, it was a workshop in a classroom sort of setting. People paid. I think people did pay. I mean, they weren't. That's a good. When Christina shows up, ask her, because she'll know. Because her research is so deep. She's amazing. She will know. All right. Anything? Anybody? Who else? Yes.
Notice that there are some, we were talking about Cascade, some of the records that you kept actually would say things about contact onto the plate using something else to like offset what was that yellow onto the plate, which is never fully explained in anything as to how that happened. It's interesting what you guys are doing with that. There's one particular piece that it's not an issue, but this I'm time expecting, so that's what happened.
This is Tyrus.
Oh, hey, Tyrus. Hi. I think there was contact inking going on. You would have your glass palette rolled with the ink, and you would basically
Yeah.
just kiss it.
Yeah, and then
The
take
plate.
it off and then you would roll.
And take it off. Yes, I think that did happen. I'm pretty sure we're right about the offset splotchy yellow business. But yeah, no, I mean, they would try anything. You know that, right?
Well, and it's interesting too because they'll say that this is an addition and they look so much the same, but it's like no, you look through the first pieces that I came in contact with were when I was in grad school, the salad piece, and they have like 4 of them in their collection and stuff in the doors, and they are not exactly the same. There's slight differences among them all. They're generally look like they're related books.
I think, yeah, in addition to being not a great businessman, he was not a good record keeper. And so, the print might say this is 25 out of 50, but there's no guarantee at all that there are 50 of those things. He didn't mind variations, that's right. I think when you get into the sort of 60s, 70s, when Hector starts printing for him, they start getting to be much more exact. But in the early years, anything really went. Yeah, I had some images of other impressions of Cascade that the British Museum has. The British Museum has like 300 of his prints, so if you ever need to look at a bunch, go there. And the colors are all over the place, and some of them are marked, artist proof or state proof, but one of them is edition. It's 32 or whatever. It looks nothing like the one we bought for the BMA. Nothing. So yeah, I think he didn't really care. I don't know. Do you think he didn't care? I think he didn't care. I think he liked it.
I don't think he cared as much as Hector. Hector really does.
Yes, Hector cares.
Sometimes.
Yeah, Hector cares a lot. And he's lovely. He's still working. I can't quite believe it. He's getting up there. Yeah, anything else I can help explain?
I could mention, bringing it kind of full circle. I mean, you all have pretty much seen the exhibitions in there, but it's exciting to see the tie-in with Ratner, as we mentioned it, in Paris and in New York. But there's a great print, Among Those Who Stood, that's in our front gallery in the Masterworks exhibition that Ratner worked with Hayter on for the MoMA exhibition, that was sort of a groundbreaking printmaking exhibition, and that was the image that the Metropolitan Museum of Art purchased. And if you look on the, I know I mentioned this in another talk, but on MoMA's website that's a record of that exhibition, you see installation shots, and I think you can make out that print in there. But they also have a copy of the exhibition catalog that has handwritten notes on it, and it says next to Ratner's sold, and we think that was the piece that was purchased by the Met, which is kind of interesting. But it's nice to see his professional relationship, but we also have their personal relationship with, there's the baby announcement with Augie's foot printed on it, and then from Tyrus's collection we have Maternity, which was printed in the same year, that obviously was another nod to what was happening in Hayter's life with, obviously that was Augie that was happening in Maternity, but a lot of great crossover and friendships that formed. And I wish, before you leave, we've got small catalogs that Tyrus has produced of his collection, thanks to the Community College of Central Florida that Tyrus works for as the professor. So their foundation funded the production of that catalog, but it's a really interesting read, and it talks a lot about the international artists that worked there and the relationships that they had.
When you said something about Augie's foot, reminded me that back in those days, artists like Hayter and Helen Phillips, they would make Christmas cards, real prints, Christmas cards, and you find them around. I'm sure you have a couple of Tyrus. Well, at the Baltimore Museum of Art, those things would come into Mrs. Breeskin, the director, and they would be sent up to the print department, and they would be shoved in a box. And so when I got there, there was, I think, 2 Soliner boxes that were marked, greeting cards, holiday cards. There was even some Valentine's, I think. There were like 6 Hayter prints in there, and they had never been accessioned into the collection. And I was like, what are you people? And so periodically, I would go through there to make sure that there wasn't some other great artist hiding in there. It was hilarious, and they're really wonderful. I think as I was looking at them and how they made them, it seemed like in the Christmas card situation, they were more experimental. Like there was that one that's completely offset off of 3 different things that rolled onto the same roller and onto the paper, and it's like, what are you doing? Just incredible stuff. And I think it was low stakes and small, and why not? Let's try it. So the Christmas cards are out there. They're pretty great.
Tyrus has a great collection of cards, and I wish that we could have incorporated that into the exhibition. You're just gonna have to do another exhibition. Yeah, but and the Augie's foot, that was one that we found in our. Yeah. We have a massive archive for Ratner that we're have been culling through and cataloging as we go, and that was a piece that, with our volunteers pulled out, along with our Françoise Gillot drawing that's dedicated to Ratner and his wife.
Nice.
They're like, oh, look at what we found. I was like, oh my God. So, yeah.
The secrets in the story.
I love it.
Yeah. Anything else, Tyrus?
So, we need to welcome Tyrus Clutter to the group. Thank you so much for coming all this way. Yeah, I mean, Baltimore, Ocala, can anybody top that? I mean, that's amazing. Do you guys have any other questions, or definitely have a little time, if you need to, I mean, I think this was supposed to end at 6:30, it's now 6:42, but, oh no.
I timed myself this afternoon and I thought, there's no way I can make it to 45 minutes, sorry.
No, this was wonderful. And thank you so much. Thank you.